Well, I'm excited for this discussion today and with our esteemed panelists. First, I'm going to give some brief introductions, and then we'll just get right into the discussion. First, to my right, we have Dr. Hussein Jirdeh. And Dr. Jirdeh is a member of the Space Telescope Science Institute Executive Directorate, and he is in charge of leading the Office of Public Outreach, which is responsible for informing and inspiring the public about the discoveries of the Hubble Space Telescope and the promise of the James Webb Space Telescope, which is the largest science project in US history. And I can't really see you guys in the audience, but just a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the James Webb Telescope? So you see, yay, okay, great. So I was just gonna give a brief update on that, and just in case for any of the other folks who are participating or who will watch this talk afterward. So the James Webb Telescope, it's the next orbiting observatory and the successor, as you know, to Hubble. And it will be the biggest telescope ever in space. It's a tennis court-sized telescope that's orbiting far beyond the Earth's moon, or will orbit beyond the Earth's moon. And it will detect infrared radiation and be capable of seeing in that wavelength, as well as Hubble that sees invisible light. And how precise are we talking exactly? So the Webb will be able to detect heat generated, or equivalent to heat generated by a bumblebee as far away as the moon. That's pretty extraordinary. So everybody meet Dr. Jirdeh. And then also to our right, we have Dr. Debbie Berebichez. And many of you saw her amazing talk this morning, so I won't go into too much in terms of her background, but as you know, she is an esteemed physicist, TV host, and STEM advocate. And she is the first Mexican woman to graduate with a physics PhD from Stanford University. I love saying that. And she's also the co-host of Discovery Channel's Outrageous Acts of Science. And that particular show, that's where she uses her physics background to explain the science behind extraordinary engineering feats. And she also co-stars on the TV show Humanly Impossible, that's produced by National Geographic, and has appeared as an expert on the Travel Channel, Nova, CNN, and numerous international media outlets. And you're also, I was going to say, in addition to your show, you're the chief data scientist at NECSS. Just wanted to briefly mention that here in New York. And also her work in science education and outreach has been recognized by a number of publications. So we're very glad to have you here as well. And finally, Heather Berlin, our cognitive neuroscientist. Dr. Berlin is a cognitive neuroscientist and assistant professor of psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai here in New York. And she explores the human brain and mind with the goal of contributing to improved treatment and prevention of impulsive and compulsive psychiatric disorders. She's also interested in the neural basis of consciousness, dynamic unconscious processes, and creativity. And Dr. Berlin is a visiting scholar at the New York Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, and was a visiting professor at Vassar College, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, University of Zurich, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And you will also hear from Heather again tomorrow afternoon, so stay tuned for that incredible session. And Heather, you've also spoke, in addition to Debbie, sorry. You've both, I was just going to mention the other panel that you all participated on a couple years ago in Women in Science. I just wanted to refer to that as well. So please give a round of applause to our panelists one more time. Thank you. So I just mentioned that, about the Women in Science panel, and of course, we've seen so many incredible discussions and panels on diversity in STEM, women in science, and like I said, building off of that recent NECSS Women in Science panel that we saw a couple years ago with some of our other famous, or a few of our heroes, astronaut Katie Coleman, Elise Andrews. So I didn't want to repeat, the same topic on that, although it's still a top priority to discuss. It overlaps quite nicely with what we're discussing today, and all of us, we have a passion for STEM education advocacy, empowering our younger generation. especially young females, to learn and pursue careers in science. But I thought it would be fascinating for our audience to hear from each of you and your particular perspectives and experiences, specifically from a broader standpoint on the topic of diversity. What it means to you. Is it important to innovation, exploration, discovery, scientific advancements? So to set the stage, I thought I would show you this photo, and if we can pull up the picture after the diversity definition. So again, to set the stage for the discussion, I wanted to show you this. And this particular photo is something that I've referred to growing up as a student. I would always refer to this particular picture when I would see and encounter my own experiences in terms of diversity or adversity in terms of science. So, how many of you recognize where this was taken? Just curious. Any? Yes, okay, some. So it's from the 1927 Fifth Solvay International Conference, which is a physics conference founded by Belgian chemist Ernest Solvay, gathering some of the world's brightest to solve problems and challenges in physics and chemistry. And I'm sure you can recognize a few familiar faces, or at least the one in the middle with the cool hair, world-renowned physicist Albert Einstein, and my personal hero. And now 17 of these attendees were or became Nobel Prize winners. And Marie Curie, the woman in the bottom left, was one of them. And she was the first woman ever to win a Nobel Prize, and she won for her pioneering research about radioactivity, and was the only person to win 2 Nobel Prizes in multiple sciences. So I would look at this picture as a young student, and when I was aspiring to be a scientist, and think, okay, who else could we put in this picture? Who else could we add in here that looks like me? Or how different would this look if we were to take the same photo today? So going back to the slide before, thank you. So what is diversity? We have these definitions, of course, and in the context of what we're discussing today, a vast effort to sort of remake or shape society to include everyone, not just in these privileged positions, but in culture, politics, business. And in science in particular, diversity goes to the heart of how we do research and innovation effectively. So I think it also helps us define how we look at the world, how we approach a problem, and the fact that we look at problems differently. So on that, each of you have some extremely fascinating and incredible backgrounds. So I wanted to ask each of you, what does diversity in science mean for you? And what was the defining point where you might have encountered adversity specifically in some way, or had a defining diversity in science moment? We can start with Dr. Jirdeh.
So just picking up on the James Webb Space Telescope, this is the most powerful and most complicated scientific instrument probably ever built. It required 20 new technologies. It requires us to understand things that we may not be able to visualize over a long period of time. That requires creativity and a diverse background and skill sets and thinking and creativity. Every day we're talking about creating the data sets needed to be able to maneuver that telescope and collect very faint science data 1 million miles from Earth. That requires teams to work together for a long, long time on complex subjects. I think, in my view, probably every day, we're dealing with issues that require all voices to be heard and all background experience to be listened to. And the best ideas are coming from everywhere. We cannot be, so that's where women, minorities, people with backgrounds different than you and I, all come together to deal with these issues, and creativity comes from that. In my view, that's one example.
That's great.
So just to throw some statistics out there, because I care very much about diversity, 47% of people graduating with college degrees are women. And out of those, 59% of the graduating women occupy the workforce. However, when it comes to the higher positions, executive positions in academia, in industry, etc., only the top 8% occupies the top, are women getting the best salaries, the top salaries, and occupying the top executive positions in the C-suite level. And I'm from Mexico, and when it comes to Hispanics, I was talking to Dr. Hussein, I should first say the statistics in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, as you all know, 24% is occupied by women out of all the STEM workforce. And out of that, only 4% is occupied by Hispanics. So I grew up in Mexico City in a very conservative community that typically discouraged women and girls from pursuing careers in science, especially the hard sciences. And I was told at a very young age that I should better pick, when I confessed that I dreamt of doing math and physics, that I better pick a more feminine career. My mother literally told me that I would never be able to get married if I studied physics, which almost happened, but I guess
She married a physicist, by the way.
Yeah,
Yes.
only a physicist would take me. But I grew up with very overt discouragement, which is it's dangerous and it's bad. But once I came to the U.S. and I was able to do my BA and meet other women, and I felt that this was a much more open society, in a way, I almost felt that the more dangerous bias was the subtle one that constantly we hear in the media, the typical role models that we see where young girls wanted to follow Britney Spears and this and that, and much rather than any scientific or technical role model, and TV commercials, of girls playing with cars or any other more typically masculine toys, were told to stay away from that and stay away from numbers. And it was this subtle message that really preoccupied me even more. And for the past 12 years, I've devoted a lot of my time to help run initiatives that help empower young women and young minorities to pursue their dreams of doing a career in STEM.
So a few things that I'm going to just a few personal experiences I've had. One that kind of always stays there in my mind is that when I was working, actually doing research at a medical school, not the one I'm currently at, but a medical school here in New York, very prominent medical school, which I won't name, but I was doing research, and at the time I had actually I'd gotten into medical school, but I eventually decided to go for my PhD instead. But at the time, I was thinking about going in to be a neurosurgeon, and I was working with the neurosurgeons and in the department. And I spoke to the head neurosurgeon, and he said to me at the time, and this was probably in the late 90s, I would say, I just want to save you some trouble right now. I know you're interested in doing neurosurgery. It's a very long road. You have to do residency and this and that. And the top positions in the medical field are like cardiovascular surgery and neurosurgery. They pay the most. And he said those residencies, they are still reserved for men. So it's going to be very unlikely that you're going to do all this work, you're going to get to that point, and there's really probably you're not going to get into a residency program. So I'm just going to save you that trouble right now. And this, obviously I was very frustrated by this. It's not why I ended up not going into neurosurgery, because of course then I said, oh, well, now I'm going to do this. But I ended up, my interests went elsewhere. But to be told that, this is modern times, we're not talking about, and this is New York, it's very progressive. So there's still those barriers there. I never, and even in the field I'm in now, in basic academic research and neuroscience, the top positions, the heads of the medical schools, the heads of the hospitals, it's men. Now, in terms of the unconscious bias, a lot of it is people either say, is it women thinking they can't do it, telling themselves no, or is it people at the top stopping them from getting through these barriers? But I think there is a lot to do with, as Debbie mentioned, the unconscious bias that's out there. Our brain is like making these calculations all the time. It's taking in information and stimuli and making these unconscious decisions and motivating our behavior. And if you never see women in these positions, over time, it has an effect on you. You think, well, maybe that's not for me. Maybe, I don't belong there. And so I've been on the National Academy of Sciences has this committee called the Science and Entertainment Exchange, where we're working hard actually with people who are top writers in Hollywood of film and television that has a really great outreach to help them try to incorporate more women in these science positions so that it'll start getting into our psyche, into the popular culture over time. Maybe the next generation, it won't be so uncommon to see women scientists on TV. And just actually earlier this week, I met with the science advisors to Obama, and he has a great initiative to encourage diversity in the sciences. And part of that is to get these Hollywood writers, again, to incorporate women scientists as these to be their characters if they have to make a character choice, or African Americans or Hispanics, or getting the diversity issue out there. And I think that's really key to get it in our psyche. Then women will feel less intimidated. It'll just be the norm, or people of color. And the last thing is that I think it's really crucial for creativity, as you were saying, because creativity is about making these novel associations between ideas. And again, a lot of it happens unconsciously, and it is based on the things that we've experienced. And so if you've experienced different things throughout your life, you're going to come to the table with new and alternative creative ideas. If it's all, let's say like on that panel, just white men, I mean, they'll be thinking they've had certain types of experiences, and you're not going to get a lot of that novelty, which is crucial for scientific discovery, thinking outside the box. So.
And that's actually great that you mentioned in terms of the media. That was actually one of my questions that I had a little bit later, which is how much of a role do you think that the media is playing? And when you're talking about especially these unconscious biases that we have, that they actually do make a huge difference. And what do you see, how that's, if it is shifting in that way, or obviously there's these councils that are happening. I mean, I see the outreach that you're working on in terms of the telescope and the stuff that you do with your TV shows. How is that all sort of playing into that direction? Is it moving the needle? Do you see that with the work that you're doing? Or I don't know if you want to weigh in.
I mean, in our show, Outrageous Acts of Science, we're half women, half men, and I think it's wonderful. But I still am amazed at how much I get in trouble for portraying femininity. So very recently, the Einstein estate, so the people who own Einstein's licensing, and every product has to go through them. They're called Corbis. It's a media company, and they own the Einstein Facebook name and the Twitter handle and whatnot, the official one. So they have millions of followers, and they said, "Hey, why don't we partner and we do a Facebook Live event for Einstein's birthday?" And they chose me to be the explainer, the presenter for general relativity, special relativity, and we had a blast. Thousands of viewers participated in the event, asking questions and all that. But as soon as they put my picture and as to promote the event, it had all these negative comments like, why are they using, that doesn't look like a scientific advert. It's not serious enough. Why, all kinds of, I'll save you from the more negative words that were thrown around. But it really hurts me because, you do all these, it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We're doing all that in the name of science. We're putting our face out there. And there's definitely a lot of people commenting quite positively and critically said, if there was a man on that ad promoting the scientific event, it didn't matter what color he was wearing, how long his hair was, it would never even come into question. But when there's a woman in place, there's all these constraints and restrictions. And so I do think that there's still this stigma that even within science, you have to look a certain way, you have to behave a certain way, so that diversity within minorities is still extremely constrained in the media, in my opinion.
That's a very good point. I think the issue we have with diversity in the workforce, in the science area, especially in science, space science, is we're losing a large number of minorities and women in the pipeline. They come into the science with an interest in science, and we lose them. And there are many reasons for that. But one key reason is they don't see themselves in that picture. And that is a model and a story that we're telling in the media every day, like you just said. So it's very important to change the tone and the conversation, to say African-American young men and women can see themselves as being the new leaders in the science areas and play a role in these very complex scientific stories. So Hollywood and the media has a very important role to play in this, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's getting slightly better. I feel like these initiatives, like with the National Academy of Sciences, the Science and Entertainment Exchange got, for example, the movie Thor. It was a popular film for young kids, and the main character, the scientist in that film was, or I think it was going to be either a female nurse or a male scientist. Anyway, consulted with us, and it turned out it became a female. I think she was like a physicist, played by Natalie Portman. Right, and that was our initiative that came from this committee, and that changed. So now maybe women see her there and say, oh, I can do that. I can be a powerful. So I think that but it's not just about having those one or two role models. It's about making it the norm, so that on average, it's just as normal. I use as an example, I grew up in New York, Jewish, right? And that was normal. I mean, like half the people in my school were Jewish. It wasn't a thing. And then when I moved to Europe, where there wasn't so many Jewish people, it became like, oh, you're Jewish. Like that was something different. That was, and it wasn't the norm, which is fine. But what we want to do is make these things the norm. So it's not a weird thing to see a woman presenting, Einstein or whatever. That's just the norm. Nobody thinks twice about it. And that's about changing how the brain makes calculations unconsciously. And so that women also feel like, why can't I be, cool and go into science? And those are the things that the media can do. And I think we're starting to get there. We're starting to get there. And it doesn't always have to be, it could be some side character that happens to be a woman or an African American or, that's just there in the background. But it just starts to seep in over time. And I think that's key to helping change things.
I was actually going to mention, I know that to your point, that the pipeline, it's still obviously, in terms of the workforce, that we still need to make huge adjustments. Actually, one of the slides that I have, if you can just fast forward to the third one that I have up there, I was going to make a quick note that for the first time recently, half of the astronaut class actually at NASA are women. And that's obviously a big deal. And we're seeing some of these underrepresented groups to start to see them fill some of these roles. Even though, to your point, Dr. Jirdeh, that it's still we're not quite there. We definitely need to make a lot of oh, here it is. You can see that the photo. So this was just recently. So those are the things that, to your point, Dr. Berlin, that we obviously, these are the images that we need to see to help with that, or shift that bias and shift those sort of unconscious thoughts in relation to something like this. If we have, something that we can look towards or aspire to, and I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, but this is something that I think is really powerful to see. Wanted to quickly shift in terms of diversity. One of the other things I wanted to mention is, and in relation to this, we've mentioned some of these things that we need to work on, but in your respective areas, where have you seen advancements, like you were just alluding to, but anything else that we can point to, or any strategies that we can discuss just to show that, okay, even though these are the pieces that we obviously need to work on, but how can we sort of focus on, okay, what are the steps that we are taking? Is there anything that you can share in relation to?
One example I can give is in astronomy and in science. I think we've made great strides in enabling more opportunities for women to join and get PhD levels and be faculty members. At Space Telescope Science Institute, where I work, we have come a long way, very long way. 20 years ago, we didn't have any faculty members or tenured faculty members in my department, in my office, and now we have a sizable number. So we've succeeded in that. I don't think we've done so well with African Americans and Hispanics in general, but with women in the sciences, I think we've made a really good stride. There's long ways to go, but we've made good progress. That's one example.
That's great.
I think one thing that can be done and is being done is to make these environments more like hospitable to women, make women want to go into these fields. So when I was coming up, like I happened to have been really good at math when I was in high school, and that was my thing. And and then I was a math major in college, and then I remember the head of the math department called me in and said, you really got to stick with this because it's so unique, because you're a Caucasian woman and that's, a rarity in this math field. So you really got to, and I was like, okay, but why should I, what is this going to lead me to? And he said, well, you can get your, you can be a math major, and I was like, and then what? And then, then you can get your PhD in math, and then what? Well, then you can be a math professor and just do math all day. And, that didn't really, that didn't appeal to me because, on average, listen, women and men do have differences in their brains, not in terms of intelligence, but in terms of types of ways of thinking. Women tend to have on average, again, there's variation, but more social emotional intelligence. They care more about, social issues, relationship issues, as well as being good at science or whatever. But if you tell me I'm going to sit in a room and just do math all day, that's not something that's appealing to me. So what people can do, and places like Google have started to do this, is make it a place that women would want to go, that they'd want to, so they now have better, they have a year maternity leave, and they have also for paternity leave as well. Make it environments where you have more social interactions involved. So there's ways to attract more women into these fields who have just as brilliant science brains, but maybe they want more. There's something else that would make it more appealing to them. So it's not just sort of a man's world, so to speak. So and organizations and companies are starting to do this to attract more women.
Yeah, I mean, steering the conversation a little bit towards the business world, and I'm actually quite critical about what Google is doing, because if you go there, you'll still see that most women are in the administrative positions and very few in tech, and these gender-based definitions of what constitutes a women-appropriate job is still pretty old school. But I do think we live in America, especially in a very pragmatist society, which has its good and its bad. On the good side, we're extremely results-oriented. And businesses have realized that if the products they create do not mimic the needs and the behaviors of a very diverse population, they're just not going to have profits. And so purely based on profits, things have changed. And one typical example is, for example, when they engineered airbags for cars, it turns out the engineering team that designed them did not have any women. And they designed them to be quite large for the dimensions of the average man. And when they got tested, actually, no, they rolled them out into the market, and I believe a lot of women and children were choking to death because they were so large, and the effect was counterproductive until they realized, they could have brought a short person, but they brought a woman who on average had, a smaller dimension than the men, and they redesigned the airbags, and that started working. And so companies are definitely, have that in mind, and how we need to, if I want to appeal to Hispanics, I better hire Hispanic engineers to design my app or my product. And that's a good thing, but it's not enough. And what really pains me is that there's very little discussions of the ethics of diversity. The simple fact of doing the right thing, because it's the right thing to give access and opportunity to people. And I think that sometimes, and like I was telling Dr. Hussein in the back, there are areas in science, I bet you that if I go to a theoretical physics department and I argue with them that having a woman there is just going to create better aspect of string theory, they're going to laugh at me because they say we don't care about gender, we don't care about particularly things in the brain that work differently for women. We just care about some incredible mathematically and physics-able person to come up with new theories. And so should those people and those departments close their diversity pipeline? No, there are reasons purely based on doing the right thing that I think in the American political system and in the pipeline are not being heard just because they're not profit related.
Well, and how, I know we were talking about this a little bit before, how do you respond to, when it comes to diversity, we were talking a little bit about this, everybody brings their own personal experiences to the table. So how does that particular perspective weigh in on, even though it can be something linear, or you're talking about the mathematics side, you would think that doesn't that affect what that yield is, or what that output is, so to speak? How is that not understood, or to what you're just mentioning now? Why is there such resistance towards something like that?
Maybe you
I don't know. Go ahead.
I'm not so sure if there's as much resistance anymore. There is still a long gaps in training and education and the pipeline. But I think companies that don't understand that there's a global search and competition for talent are not going to be around. And talent doesn't come in one color or one gender. Talent comes across in human experience and human understanding and human creativity. And so that's the future. The future belongs to being able to provide in this country and elsewhere in providing a level playing field and level opportunity so you can tap the talent. Look at Silicon Valley, and they're coming from all over the world. They're hiring from the best and the brightest from anywhere in the corner of the world. And that's what the future is. So there is resistance to companies, maybe, and culture, maybe, and certainly experience, because it requires a lot of training to do the kind of work you do. It takes a decade of training and postdoc, and that requires people to stay with it and have a future stake in the game. And we see that in space science always.
And I think a key issue with that, I mean, for me, like going through doing a PhD and a postdoc and sticking with it, is that I did have a mentor. I had a very strong, competent female PhD, one of my PhD supervisors, and she really helped me through a lot of the things that I struggled with personally, going through a system where, I was at Oxford, which is very like old school and traditional, and I literally was told when I was in my lab by other students, you should, if you dress down like a little frumpy, people will take you more seriously. I was told that, and it was legit. I mean, like, actually, I ended up not wearing makeup and trying to be, and like, just so I can play the role of like looking like, more, I don't know, traditional nerdy or something. I don't know what it was, but, and I spoke to her, and she really helped me. I needed a mentor in that respect. But this is the thing. I think in business, I think you make a really good point that there are arguments, rational arguments that can be made that are dealing with the bottom line. Like, you're going to make more money if you have more diversity, in your ranks. And I think that's a good argument to make. But you're not always appealing to people rationally. And so there was a study that was done by Jo Handelsman. She's one of the now head advisors, scientific advisors to Obama, where she is a scientist, and those studies there's studies where they show that if you give people the same resume, but if it has like a Caucasian sounding name or like an African American sounding name, they're more likely to, and it's the same exact resume, they'll be more likely to take the Caucasian person. Well, so a lot of scientists said, well, we're objective in science, like we don't have these biases, but of course we're all human. So she did this study where she sent out CVs to her fellow academics, professors in science, and said, would you hire this person as a postdoc? And they were the same exact CVs, and the only difference was it was a male name versus a female name. And sure enough, the men got, significantly chosen more to be the postdoc in the lab versus the women. So these unconscious biases are still there. So even though you can make these rational arguments to people about why, because of ethical reasons or, financial reasons, it's good to have diversity, there's still this latent thing going on that's resistance. And I don't think it's necessarily people's fault. I really think it's just like at a societal level that things need to change in a large way for this resistance to kind of break down.
I was going to add also in terms of the salaries, that same study I heard that they found that the salaries also favored on the male side versus the female side. Go ahead.
Well, there's a gender gap, and it's about 7% or so in STEM. And I was going to say that you reminded me of a recent article called Are Women Better Coders in Computing? And it came out, and it was just received thousands of comments and all that, because as you probably know, and you've seen their coding camps for young girls sprouting all over the US and the world, and black girls who code, women who code, girls who code, Latinas who code, etc. And this study, it was actually kind of faulty, to be honest, and they themselves admitted it's not peer-reviewed yet and whatnot. But the way the media portrayed and reported the results, totally twisting them and claiming, yes, women are better coders. There was no evidence to show for that. And, I can go into the details offline. But what worries me about doing stuff like that is that it positions diversity as a gender war. And it's about who's better, and women on average have to be better to be accepted. And I think that's the wrong thing to do. First of all, it's going to just engender more hostility from the people who already are against diversity. And two, it's not really about who's better. Again, it's about providing access and opportunity. I really I watched by coincidence Neil deGrasse Tyson's one of his videos yesterday, and he gets asked this question: what about what Larry Summers, while president at Harvard, said about women being genetically less able to be mathematical and academic, analytical, to have academic positions, faculty positions. And I love what Neil deGrasse said. He said, you know what, I haven't never been a woman before, but I'm a black man. And I can tell you that before you even ask the question of genetic abilities, let's first give everybody enough access and years of the same equal opportunity to be able to make a judgment of that nature. And I really, really appreciate that.
That's great. Were you going to add something? Yeah, that's great. Were you going to add something?
Yeah, that's a very good example of making an experiment or a judgment about something that you don't have any data. There is no, it's a bad, any scientist will tell you that's a bad idea. And then the whole question of the genetic makeup and whether actually color exists and is a question to be asked.
Absolutely. And that's a great example, too. I'm glad that you brought that up. One of the things that you mentioned, I think you might have said this, Heather, in terms of normalizing. And so I'm just going to throw you a little bit of a curveball, but we've discussed some of these big pieces about this, but what have you specifically done in your respective fields to help normalize this concept of diversity in science or space exploration, or what have you specifically done from a strategy perspective that you can share?
One thing.
I know you talked about that from the broader perspective in terms of the telescope program, but go ahead.
For a specific example is we part of our office is to tell the story of Hubble Space Telescope and its discoveries. And we have an outreach program that goes out and reached all 50 states. And in that example, we use a diverse workforce to tell the story, because what we would like to see is someone goes to Baltimore City Schools. We want the kids in Baltimore City Schools to see themselves in that story. So I can be like that. I can look like that. I see people who look like me, have the same background and experience, and are now astrophysicists or physicists or theoretical scientists or data analysis for the Space Telescope. So having that experience and having that connection, I think, is very important. It's a part of our strategy. When we go out, we go out with a team that's diverse.
That's great.
Well, this is a theme that's very close to my heart, so I've tried to work on a number of projects with these. So the company that I now help run, I create curriculum for data science, and I am renaming all the pre-existing curriculum, all the projects with female names of famous mathematicians and scientists. I fought very hard to give a scholarship to women, Pacific Islanders, former military personnel, etc., all minorities, because they're underrepresented in coding. Together with Girls Inc., I created, together with other 5 women, we created the first data science curriculum for underserved high school girls in the country, and it's now being distributed across underserved schools. I also was the global ambassador for Technovation Challenge, which is the longest running and largest tech competition for young underserved women in the world. And Technovation Challenge, not only did I help sort of launch the program, but I became the mentor for Graciela Garcia, who's an incredible woman of Mexican origin as well, who I met, a very shy girl in one of the New York City high schools I visited. And she had arrived in this country with her mother undocumented. And so the mother was very afraid of getting Graciela to extracurricular activities. And I took her under my wing and I mentored her for a number of years, and her team ended up being the winning team in Technovation Challenge 2013. Google is our partner, and so she and her teammates obtained at the time $10,000, now it's up to $20,000, to create the app professionally, and they create a company, they end up with an LLC. And so this 16-year-old girl ended up having her own company, working towards financial stability, and all that went to a scholarship fund. And I can proudly say that Graciela is finishing her first year at University of Penn in computer science.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, I've done, I guess, my small share of things. I've done a lot of mentoring. I'm part of a program where we mentor like underprivileged women who are interested in science, as well as a lot of the hiring that I've done in terms of like, even if it's like a lab assistant or, or like a research assistant or postdocs, I really take that into consideration. And, whether it's my bias or not, I tend to have mentored women through the years. And I just find that really personally gratifying because, I can identify the way my mentor did for me, I feel like I'm giving back in that way. So, and that's on sort of in my little domain. And then on the larger scale, a lot of what I'm doing with the entertainment industry and trying to get more women out there, I think is really important on a larger scale. And then just being, a lot of this times I talk about just do it, be a role model yourself, be a female scientist, go out there. I do a lot of science communication and public speaking, and I don't always have to go out there and say like, look, you just be it and do it. And then you'll find, I find that after I've given a talk or something, there'll be these students who come up to me and say like, it felt really good to see you up there. And that, I think if we all do our share in that way, just be it and do it. And I'm doing this TV show, Science Goes to the Movies, where we're reviewing films from a scientific perspective. And I'm the scientist, the female scientist. My co-host is female. The producer of the show is female. We bring on guests, and a lot of the time it's diverse, and we make it a point to do that. So, in that way, I think I'm doing my share as much as I can to start opening people's minds up.
With your daughter.
Yeah, and I have a daughter. I don't know what that means, but she's the next generation.
Well, actually, that was actually going to be my next question. How can we, as building off what you were just describing in each of your respective fields, how can we as adults influence the younger generation to be more inclusive, especially looking at diversity in science? Also encouraging those social interactions with fellow students or amongst themselves. How can we sort of help guide them and push in the right direction, and sort of give some sort of strategies on that? Do you have any thoughts? No?
Well, my 2 cents, like what I'm doing with my daughter who's 2.5, is we really made it a point, and I think, we should start doing this, is not, the toys that she plays with and like the outfits she wears, stop making this we already conditioned children from such an early age. I started seeing this being a mom is like, these are the toys the boys play with, they build the blocks and whatever, and girls plays with dolls. And, of course, if she wants to play with dolls, that's great. But she loves building things. She says like, I want to be an architect, and we have her all building blocks and doing things. And I think, as parents, to encourage that, stop, get away from the gender stereotyping toys at a young age, because that's when our brains are forming. That's when we're deciding who we think we are and what we should be. So I think starting at those crucial early developmental years, having programs like in kindergarten level that where you're really saying, stop splitting up the genders into these stereotyped roles. That's a really good place, I think, to start.
I also want to add that sometimes people that see us scientists from the outside think, oh, you can be a mentor because you have gone through an experience and you have that knowledge to impart. But it's not really the case. We all of us can be mentors to anyone. And we all know somebody who needs to believe in themselves a little more, whether it's the neighbor, your daughter, your son, your cousin, your friend, your colleague at work. Somebody needs for somebody in their life to step up and say, hey, I want to help you believe in your dreams. And so many people have dreams of doing things that are not fitting to the world and to the social construct that they belong to. And so just look for ways of mentoring people, act as a role model, reach out, even when you think they don't really need it or they don't want to hear, just look around you and always, spark curiosity. That's one thing I always tell parents. If your kid asks questions, I was the most annoying, inquisitive child you could imagine, just asking. And, there comes a point where I understand parents are like, okay, just watch TV or do something else. But, just never tell a kid that, the answer right away to a question or where to look it up. Go through the process of finding things out. Like Feynman said, a beautiful title of a book, The Pleasure of Finding Things Out. If you go through that process with a young person, hey, I don't know myself why the sky is blue, but let's try to figure out. Do you think it's this? Well, no, because the consequences would be that. And just some critical thinking, engaging in those exercises with people around you bring a lot to your community. And I think we all ought to do that more.
One more thing is there are specific set of tools and techniques that everybody needs to learn in the middle school, elementary and middle school, to be able to reach up to these science levels. There are math tools, there are physics tools, there are the ideas of being creative, problem-solving tools. And our education system is good, but we may need to rethink the way we teach math, for example, early enough, because without that skill set, nothing's going to fix us to be able to provide equal opportunity for diversity.
And I'm glad that you made the point in terms of anybody can be a mentor or encourage, because personally I experienced the same thing, and I actually had some friends, teachers, family that tried to discourage me to say, oh, math's not for you, or physics, what are you going to do with that? Same thing with you, what are you going to do with that in the real world? Trying to kind of get me away from some of these areas, and I kept pushing forward and didn't want to listen to that, because I saw that, okay, there are other people doing this, and even though I got some of these discouraging remarks, but I think anybody can, if anybody can try to serve as that, it definitely helps, for students to see and just to hear, even this, as tiny and nominal as it can be, it makes a huge difference. And also the tools, I think, agreeing with you too, I was personally, when I started in learning math and physics and getting exposed to some of these things, not having to worry about the gender piece, my family was very strong in encouraging that. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind, that, I was participating in science fairs and not really caring that, didn't really understand the concept of, oh, if I'm a female, I can't do something like that. I didn't really see that existed, at least at that point. But yeah, I think that those are all great. Were you going to add something too? Okay. All great points. And that was one of the main things I wanted to touch on too, in terms of how can we inspire the future generation, and hopefully with some of these things that you've been describing in terms of moving the needle in that direction. I think all of these are great strategies that we're sort of moving the ship in the right way. And I wanted to give the audience just a little bit of time. We have about 7 to 8 minutes to do a quick Q&A, or just a few question answers before we wrap up. I think there might be a mic somewhere in the audience, somewhere. Oh wow, now we finally get to see you guys.
Please say your name.
Hi.
Hi.
So I think we have, is there going to be a mic, or do you want me just to?
Just yell.
Or we can yell? We can do it that way. We can, if you want to shout, and then I can repeat it until we get a mic. And there we go. There's a mic. Okay, great. Right here in the front. Great.
Great. So 2 quick questions. The first one, if you don't have a good answer, it's okay. The question about gays as part of the diversity that we're talking about here, because I don't really see myself represented very much. That's sort of, and I don't know how to deal with that. So the second question is my main question. Here's this question. There's a recent controversy, it seems, with safe spaces where sometimes conservative identifying people don't feel like they're represented within the diversity that we're talking about. How do you feel about that, particularly when we're looking about sort of this enthusiastic naivety in society, which is sort of a central theme of of the conference, where there's a lot of people who are anti-vaccination and whatever. It seems almost essential that we try to incorporate people from those communities into the pipeline of science. And so what are your thoughts about that, particularly within the context of this sort of like conservatives feeling left out of the diverse complex?
Mm-hmm. Great. Do any of you share your thoughts?
I mean, there's a lot, so there are a lot of issues that can, depending on the person who's making the decisions and their view on these particular things. So like homosexuality, or, there are other issues. They're like, what about a person who has a disease? There's people with disabilities. There are all of these issues. But I think ultimately what we need to do is increase open-mindedness, because closed-mindedness is the enemy. So, whatever the person who's making the decision is, whatever their particular viewpoint is, should be irrelevant, in terms of hiring people or getting more people interested in sciences. And so open-mindedness is key. How you can change the way people think, that's very difficult. And I do agree, there is bias in liberals towards conservatives, and but how do we? The key is that fundamentally underneath it, when we're just looking at who the person is, it's really their brain. Are they able to do science? Are they going to make a contribution? And that should be irrelevant to whatever this exterior is. And if we can ultimately get to that point, I think that'll solve a lot of the problems. How we get there is harder. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
I want to comment on the second part of the question about safe spaces. So recently, my husband told me a quote that I really like. He said, Voltaire, I believe, said that the right not to be offended is not a human right. We don't have the right not to be offended. And I love that. I'm increasingly concerned and frankly very disappointed of all these safe space fight war going on in colleges, because really, where else are we able to tell the truth? Are we able to be skeptical, to ask difficult questions that we're uncomfortable with, discussing? So I think it's incredibly damaging. It's stifling us as a society. It's making us less and less progressive and going back to structures of society that are, antique and old, and we're not able to grow and understand each other better. So I'm very against that. And and I think the part of the gay and transgender and all that is very much part in the conversation, at least in data science and analytics. There's not only there's an entire conference called Lesbians Who Code, and they attract great speakers. It's in San Francisco, and there are all sorts of different initiatives to have more inclusion with all kinds of diverse people, and like Heather said, so that's pretty strong.
So the only thing I would add is it takes decades of training and commitment from everyone who wants to be a scientist, like the panel here, and to make someone uncomfortable in a workforce after they invested so much of their life is so unfair.
That's great. Yeah. Any other questions? I think we might have.
Come on, there has to
we
be
have
one.
I think we have time for one or two more. I think this gentleman over here. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, we'll go here, and then we'll come to you, sir.
Hi. Yeah, you guys didn't really touch on race, because sometimes I feel like I'm involved in a few different fields, and some fields I feel I am antagonized more for being a woman, but in some other fields I feel like I'm more antagonized for being a Latina. So. Yeah, what do you think about the race relations in science?
Yeah, I mean,
we can go on that for a while.
That's another hour panel. I was actually going to joke in my panel this morning that this may be my last NECSS talk because I'm Mexican, and next year I may have to be behind the wall. So I totally see where you're coming from. Yay, Chilanga. And so, I mean, that's a huge problem. And I think, ethnicity and what you associate with and belief system and all that definitely enters the diversity conversation. And I think for me, I don't want to take a long time, but I'll be more than happy to talk to you offline about this topic.
I can as well. Are we probably all of us? Yeah. And this gentleman over here, okay. Great.
I'll hold it. So my question is about the unconscious biases that a person has. I mean, I can understand that I might have some unconscious biases that I'm not aware of. So how do I kind of battle those unconscious biases since I'm not conscious of them?
So it's a good question. The way to defeat the unconscious biases, unfortunately, is not about consciously trying to make them go away. That doesn't seem to work so well. It's a good start. First of all, a good start is to be self-aware, right? To have self-knowledge and to know what your biases are. So that's the beginning. They've done some studies where if you basically feed people stimuli. So there's something called the implicit association task, where a person will say, oh, I'm not racist, right? And then you time them and see how quickly they match. They have negative words, let's say, with with black faces and positive words with white faces. And if you have an unconscious bias, you'll be quicker to match the positive words, let's say, with the white face and negative with the black face. And it also is vice versa if you switch the races around. So a person consciously says, I'm not biased, or they'll be quicker to match like homemaking things with women's names versus business type stimuli with men's names. And that's because we've been fed that information over time. So the brain just makes an approximation. But what they do is if you can show people images that are the opposite over time, you see that that has an effect actually on these unconscious implicit biases. So if you see a bunch of, I don't know, let's say, women in business suits or women in corporate, situations, it'll change your reaction times over time. So I think the key at first is knowing what your biases are, acknowledging that you might have these biases, even though if it's not politically correct to think that you do, or you don't want to believe that you do have them, and then seeing what you can change in your environment or what you can expose yourself to help sort of shift the needle in the other direction a bit. Mm-hmm. But it's really about the stimuli that the brain is taking in, because we can only consciously process so much information. There's a limited capacity. So the brain doesn't take each individual case into account and say each person I meet. It needs to make these quick decisions. And so the more stimuli you have that are going against those biases, then the brain will automatically make a quick decision in a different direction.
That's great. Did you want to add anything? Okay. Any other questions? I think there might have been one more, and then I think we will have to wrap. Or did I see?
One here.
Maybe not. It's hard to see with the lighting.
I saw.
Okay, one more, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, he pretty much said my question, but I was just going to say any advice you'd have on unconscious biases, like throughout school, maybe just towards myself and others, like throughout school and college and stuff.
That's hard. I mean, I think in general, teachers who are in school, who tend to be the kind of the role models or the people who are setting the agenda, I think it's up to them in a way to help incorporate imagery, or, it could be anything really. It's just sort of, people do it unconsciously. If you're using an example in class, teachers will tend to use these stereotypical examples. So, I think educating, or maybe even ultimately, incorporating a program in training educators to be less biased in certain directions, to incorporate alternative examples in their teaching techniques, that might help change the entire ethos in the school environment. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a place to start.
I wanted to add to that the behavioral economists such as Daniel Kahneman and Dan Ariely have run a bunch of experiments of what's called stereotype threat, which is that unconscious bias. And they basically put a randomized group to take a math test, and then they divide women and men. No, I'm sorry, two groups of women. One group is told that women significantly underperform this particular test. The other group is told the opposite, that women tend to fare quite well in this test. And after that, and of course there's statistical significance, and they're very well-run experiments, and they check that the women that are told just subtly, hey, I'm not telling you, but on average, your group tends to underperform in this test, immediately perform worse off. And so the way to combat that, and what they say works, is to make people aware that these stereotype threats exist. Nobody has to tell you. You see it on your TV, your friends, your teachers may be communicating that even without being conscious of it. And so making sure you're aware of those biases is already a big step in combating that, because then you'll be better equipped to say, I'm not going to let that influence my performance.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So I think we're out of time. Thank you for that. I think we can all agree that we need diversity. So I mean, in order to grow, to innovate, not just in science, but in general, and ensure that the inclusivity is the default, not the exception. So with that, I wanted to thank my panel for joining us here today. Thank you so much for participating.
Should we maybe give our Twitter names if they have more questions?
Absolutely, yes. So if we can go down the line, and then we'll say goodbye. So my Twitter handle is Lopez Jennifer W.
Hussein Jirdeh.
Mine is Debbie Bere.
Mine is Heather_Berlin, like the city.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And thank you for listening today. Thank you so much.